The United States of America was founded on the principle that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This American Republic in its infancy was a doubtful experiment, an unprecedented departure from monarchy in which these ideals would be tested. The emphasis on equality in the Declaration of Independence was not the intellectual invention of the Founding Fathers, but instead a product of Enlightenment ideals that had thus far formed the moral foundation behind the independence movement. Among the most influential ideas was the concept of natural rights, the inherent, universal, and inalienable rights possessed by all human beings, not by virtue of their social standing or citizenship, rather by virtue of their humanity. This concept would serve as a guiding principle for the independence movement and the nation it birthed. But despite how firmly this philosophy seemed ingrained into the Declaration of Independence, much of the history that followed America's birth is characterized by the unfulfilled promises of equality and natural rights it espoused, and the surprisingly narrow definition of all men. No story is a better example of these broken promises than the multi-century struggle of African Americans. The progress they achieved, the setbacks they suffered, and the endurance of their fight for equality is what sets it apart as one of the strongest and most compelling continuities of American history. The African struggle for equality predates the birth of the United States. In the early 17th century, England's Chesapeake colonies, with their warm climate and fertile soil, were ideal for the cultivation of labor-intensive cash crops. Though the Chesapeake colonies faced starvation and near extinction in their early years, they emerged from an uncertain era as thriving, commercially oriented settlements. The key to this transformation was tobacco. By the time the Virginia and Maryland colonies had been formally established, they had become economically reliant on tobacco exports. The problem with tobacco was that it required an immense amount of labor, and from their inception, the colonies suffered from a near chronic shortage of manpower. Early on, the solution to this labor shortage was indentured servitude and the forced labor of enslaved Native Americans, but this proved to be inadequate. Indentured servants were a risky investment, as many did not survive the full length of their contracts. Enslaved Native Americans, meanwhile, were deeply familiar with the local land, making escape easy and recapture nearly impossible. Furthermore, native populations were in a state of sharp decline, not only from conflict with Europeans, but also from disease. Smallpox and influenza in particular devastated tribes across the region. These factors made it clear that a more reliable source of labor was needed. Over time, it became apparent to colonial planters that Africans were well suited for forced labor. Africans had been in contact with Europeans for centuries and had developed immunity to European diseases. Unlike Native Americans, Africans arrived in the New World without knowledge of the land or any means of escape. These qualities made them extremely desirable forced laborers to colonists, and over time, an Atlantic trade in human cargo developed. By the middle of the 19th century, a system known as chattel slavery had been firmly solidified in the southern United States. Under this system, enslaved people were legally regarded as property. They could be bought, sold, and separated from their families at any time. Many lived in constant fear of being torn from their loved ones, a fear that slave owners deliberately exploited to enforce obedience. Slaves were denied legal rights and were entirely at the mercy of their masters, who were empowered by law to treat them however they saw fit. Slaves who resisted in any way were often subject to barbaric punishments. Whipping was a common practice, as it caused extreme pain to the victim, but it didn't incapacitate them enough to compromise their productivity. Even minor infractions, like falling short of a quota, could result in a brutal beating. Enslaved women faced an additional horror: the widespread sexual exploitation by their masters, often without consequence. While some slaves worked in domestic roles, the vast majority labored in the fields, enduring grueling conditions and long hours. By 1850, the South had become economically dependent on slavery. Over 3 million people, most of them of African descent, were enslaved in the United States, victims of an institution that robbed them of their liberty and humanity. This stood in stark contradiction to the founding ideal that all men are created equal. Abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave, worked tirelessly to expose slavery's depravity and highlight its incompatibility with the principles of freedom and equality. In his powerful 1852 speech, "What to a Slave is the 4th of July?" Douglass condemned the hypocrisy of a nation that celebrated liberty while denying it to millions. Until the freedoms celebrated on the 4th of July were extended to all Americans, he argued, the holiday had no meaning for the enslaved. Douglass became one of the most influential voices in the abolition movement, dedicating his life to the fight for racial justice. As anti-slavery sentiment grew, it began to find expression in emerging political movements such as the Free Soil Party and later, the Republican Party. In contrast to the agrarian South, the northern United States had industrialized, and its economy was based largely on trade and manufacturing. Without the same reliance on slavery, the North became the center of abolitionist activity, contributing to the growing sectional divide. This division between North and South, rooted in both ideology and economics, became became increasingly volatile. For decades, compromises had attempted to maintain a balance of power between free and slave states, but these measures only postponed an inevitable conflict. One major example was the Compromise of 1850, which sought to address the status of slavery in the territories gained from the Mexican-American War. While the compromise included some gains for the abolitionist cause, such as admitting California as a free state and ending the slave trade in Washington, D.C., it also included significant concessions to the South. Most notably, the Fugitive Slave Act required that escaped slaves be returned to their owners, even if they were captured in free states. This provision deeply alarmed many Northerners, who now found themselves forced to play an active role in maintaining slavery. The backlash against the Fugitive Slave Act heightened tensions and further exposed the deep moral and political divide that would eventually lead to civil war. Even worse for African Americans was the Dred Scott case, in which Dred Scott and his wife, both enslaved African Americans, sued for their freedom, on the grounds that their master had held them in bondage in a free territory for an extended period before returning to the South. This 1846 lawsuit ended up lasting years and snowballed in scale as tensions over slavery continued to mount. Finally, in 1857, 11 years after the lawsuit was initiated, the Supreme Court ruled Scott's argument illegitimate, and furthermore, that people of color, free or enslaved, could not be citizens, a ruling that firmly entrenched racial discrimination in American law. The national divide came to a head in 1860 with the election of Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate. Although Lincoln had pledged not to interfere with slavery where it already existed, his firm opposition to its expansion convinced many Southerners that their political power and the institution of slavery were under grave threat. Within weeks of his election, South Carolina seceded from the Union, followed by 6 more states by early 1861. Together, they formed the Confederate States of America. In April, after Lincoln attempted to resupply the federal garrison at Fort Sumter in South Carolina, Confederate forces opened fire, and the Civil War had begun. When the Civil War began, it's important to understand that the North wasn't fighting to abolish slavery, at least not yet. The North's main goal in the early years of the conflict was to preserve the Union, not necessarily to bring an end to slavery. Even when President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, it didn't immediately free all enslaved people. In fact, the proclamation only applied to Confederate states in active rebellion. This meant that border states like Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, and Maryland were exempt. Slavery would legally continue in these states beyond the end of the Civil War. Furthermore, the Emancipation Proclamation can more appropriately be described as an ultimatum. States that rejoined the Union before the end of the year would be allowed to continue slavery. This demonstrates that Lincoln, while he undeniably had good intentions and understood the immorality of slavery, placed greater importance on restoring the Union, and to this end he was willing to allow slavery. While the proclamation did give a new meaning to the Civil War, Lincoln was also using the prospect of emancipation as leverage. Slavery could have theoretically continued unscathed if every rebel state had rejoined the Union. While merely a hypothetical, this makes clear the precarious position that the future of Black Americans was in, even in the hands of one of history's most revered abolitionists. Even beyond its already limited reach, the proclamation had no real effect in areas of the South that the Union Army didn't control. In practice, it didn't free very many slaves. And furthermore, until the proclamation went into effect on January 1st, 1863, Black Americans weren't allowed to enlist in the Union Army. Even once they were, they served in segregated units and faced unequal treatment. Black soldiers were paid less, given fewer supplies, and often endured harsher conditions than their white counterparts. Further cementing their lower status was the fact that African Americans were ineligible for promotion to the rank of commissioned officer. Many Union commanders were doubtful about the competence of African American soldiers. Even Lincoln himself held reservations about their inferiority. This isn't to say, however, that progress wasn't being made. Abolitionists, both black and white, tirelessly advocated for equal treatment, and leaders such as Senator Charles Sumner pressed the federal government to recognize the contributions of black soldiers. Over time, the bravery and discipline of black regiments began to challenge common racist sentiments and force many in the North to reconsider their assumptions. Beginning with the end of the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed between 1865 and 1870. They collectively abolished slavery, granted citizenship to the formerly enslaved, and prohibited federal and state governments from denying the right to vote on the basis of race. While these amendments were a massive stride towards equality, they faced significant opposition from various factions. One of the greatest obstacles to their enforcement was the infamously uncooperative President Andrew Johnson, who vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, as well as legislation to extend the term of the Freedmen's Bureau. These bills were vital to improving the position of African Americans, and Johnson's vetoes clearly reveal his prejudice and racism. Him and his actions were major hindrances for Reconstruction and the advancement of civil rights. While the Union had triumphed over the Confederacy on the battlefield, the South seemed determined to cling to the remnants of slavery. Extreme racism and resentment towards freedmen and Union occupiers made it evident that much more needed to be done to permanently rid the South of the vestiges of rebellion. In some areas of the South, slavery threatened to resurface, or effectively continued even after the passage of the 13th Amendment, through exploitative systems such as sharecropping. Most common and most troubling was the violence that followed the emancipation of slaves. Freedmen were often targeted by bitter Southerners and were murdered, lynched, kidnapped, or illegally forced to work. This made it clear that slavery was not completely dead, and that the South was, in many ways, still resisting. This reality was not lost on many politicians, including Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and Ulysses S. Grant. Those who understood the conditions in the South also understood the necessity of holding it in a grasp of war to enforce the rights promised under the 13th Amendment. The safety of African Americans, especially those in the South, was further jeopardized by the Supreme Court's Milligan decision, which ruled that even in times of war, civilians could not be tried by military courts and must instead be tried in civilian courts. Up to that point, military courts had effectively replaced civilian courts in the South, out of fear that Southern judges would be too lenient towards hate crimes and attacks against Union forces. Johnson, largely uninterested in the well-being of African Americans, focused on leveraging the situation for his political gain. He grew increasingly frustrated with radical Republicans who called for black enfranchisement. Their belief was that granting the vote to former slaves would help prevent the South from reverting back to its old ways. Black enfranchisement was seen as a safeguard against the resurgence of slave power and as essential for lasting peace. Johnson prematurely declared the war to be over, in spite of the situation in the South. This move was a bid to make the enfranchisement of former slaves look unnecessary and radical, in an attempt to discredit radical Republicans and cause a split in the Republican Party. When justifying his declaration of peace to Congress, he selectively cited reports that indicated cooperation from the former Confederate states. However, when Secretary of War Stanton, in an effort to thwart Johnson, delivered a massive collection of reports detailing numerous crimes, including lynchings, unrest, and countless incidents of violence against recently freed African Americans, it directly challenged Johnson's narrative. Johnson, seeking to deceive Congress, withheld the full report, though Stanton had already leaked it in its entirety. These actions by Johnson were part of a broader effort to rush the transition to peace and release the South from the grasp of war that had been upholding the rights and protections of freedmen. Reconstruction, as it was outlined in the Reconstruction Act of 1867, was intended to conclude once every former Confederate state had been readmitted into the Union after ratifying the 14th Amendment. Following the Civil War, African Americans saw a significant improvement in their social and political standing. Many gained the right to vote, and a number were even elected to public office. Some even served in the U.S. House of Representatives. This unprecedented political success during Reconstruction, however, was tragically short-lived. The Compromise of 1877, which resolved the contested presidential election of 1876, led to the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. With federal protection gone, the gains of Reconstruction were quickly undone. The subsequent years marked the rise of Jim Crow laws, which effectively stripped African Americans of their civil rights through discriminatory measures such as poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. Racial violence and voter suppression became widespread, and the progress made during Reconstruction was rapidly reversed. One of the most infamous examples of this regression was the Wilmington Insurrection of 1898. In Wilmington, North Carolina, a democratically elected government composed of both white and African American officials had come to power. This multiracial government was seen by white supremacists as an affront to their beliefs and way of life. In response, a coup was launched by white Democrats, who organized an armed mob to violently overthrow the city government. The mob burned the offices of black-owned newspapers and murdered dozens of black residents. Democratically elected African American officials were forced to resign. Many were forced to flee the city. This event demonstrated the fragility of African American progress and marked a shift towards an era of legally enforced segregation and racial terror in the South. For this reason, this period is often known as the nadir of American race relations. Discrimination against African Americans, however, didn't stop there, and persisted into the 20th century. During the Great Depression, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs offered hope and relief to millions of Americans, but black communities often received an inadequate amount of aid. Though some African Americans did benefit from programs like the Works Progress Administration and Civilian Conservation Corps, they were frequently paid less than white workers and faced barriers to participation, especially in the South, where local administrators could enforce segregationist policies. The Social Security Act of 1935, one of the New Deal's most significant pieces of legislation, excluded agricultural and domestic workers. While not directly discriminative, these were jobs held disproportionately by black Americans, effectively cutting many of them off from receiving economic aid. Even so, the New Deal marked a turning point in black political engagement. The Democratic Party, once the party of the segregationist South, began to attract black voters in the North who were drawn to Roosevelt's promises of reform. Still, progress was slow, and these promises weren't delivered upon, as the nation had other crises to deal with. With the outbreak of the Second World War and the U.S.'s involvement in it, debates over segregation of the armed forces resurged in political relevance. Civil rights leaders, most notably A. Philip Randolph, launched the Double V campaign, calling for victory against fascism in Europe and victory against racism at home. But by 1945, only one of these goals had been achieved. With World War II at an end, African Americans who had valiantly served in the battle against fascism and tyranny returned home only to find that segregation persisted. The nation they had so bravely fought for still denied them many basic rights and relegated them to a second-class status. These black veterans, disappointed and disillusioned by this cold lack of recognition, played an important part in advancing civil rights. Pressure from them forced President Harry Truman to take action, and on July 26, 1948, he signed Executive Order 9981, an order that desegregated the U.S. military. While full desegregation of the armed forces would take several years, the Executive order signified the federal government's willingness to get involved in civil rights. While desegregation in the military marked a significant step towards equality, the fight was far from over. Across the nation, particularly in the South, segregation remained deeply entrenched in daily life, a reality made most visible in the realm of education. The ruling in the 1896 case of Plessy v. Ferguson had mandated separate but equal facilities, but schools for black students were often grossly inferior to those of white students. This disparity made it clear that black children were not seen as worthy of the same investment in their education as white children, a reality that significantly limited their opportunities. It was this glaring injustice that drove civil rights activists to take the issue to court. The collection of cases known as Brown v. Board of Education were a direct challenge to the policy of separate but equal. The lead case, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, involved a young black girl, Linda Brown, who was denied entry to a nearby white school. Backed by the NAACP, her father sued, arguing that segregation violated the 14th Amendment. In 1954, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, overturning Plessy v. Ferguson. It was a major victory for civil rights, though fierce resistance, especially in the South, slowed its impact. While the federal government had begun to take a more active role in supporting civil rights, not everyone in power was on board. This divide became especially clear with the release of the Southern Manifesto in 1956, a formal statement of opposition to the Brown v. Board of Education decision, signed by over 100 members of Congress, almost all of them from the South. The manifesto was a direct challenge to the court's decision. The signers argued that the court had abused its power by forcing integration on states, which they claimed violated the principle of states' rights guaranteed by the Constitution. They insisted that education should be controlled by local governments, not the federal government, and that each state had the right to decide how to run its schools. The manifesto described Brown as a dangerous step that threatened to destroy the fabric of our society and encouraged citizens to use all lawful means to resist desegregation. This led to a period known as massive resistance, where states and local governments passed laws to block school integration. But resistance met resistance, and in 1957, President Eisenhower sent federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas to enforce school integration and protect the historic Little Rock Nine. Even after Brown, segregation persisted in daily life. In Montgomery, Alabama, black riders were still forced to sit at the back of buses. Years of frustration boiled over when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat in December 1955. Her arrest sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, led by then unknown Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. For over a year, black residents walked or carpooled instead of riding the buses, enduring threats and violence. In 1956, the Supreme Court ruled bus segregation unconstitutional, another major win. The boycott launched King into national prominence and helped energize the broader movement. This momentum led to the 1963 March on Washington, where over 250,000 people gathered to demand justice. It was there that Dr. King delivered his I Have a Dream speech, calling on the nation to fulfill its democratic promise. After years of pressure, President Lyndon B. Johnson made civil rights a priority, and on July 2, 1964, he signed the historic Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law. This act banned segregation in public places, prohibited discrimination in employment, and gave the federal government the power to enforce voting rights. This was absolutely huge. The Civil Rights Act was the most significant civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. While it didn't end racism, it dismantled the legal foundation of segregation and marked a turning point in American history. No longer did the United States support a system of racial hierarchy.